G'day everyone, Max here from Evidence-Based Football Manager. This is part 5 of my FM23 training analysis series. Today we're going to talk about individual training in FM23. This is a topic that's requested all the time and I've been putting it off for many months, but I finally got around to doing some experiments on it. If you go into the training page in FM23, there are 4 types of individual training that you can assign to your players. First, you can tell your players to start learning a new position. Second, you can set an additional focus, which is basically asking your players to work on a specific set of attributes. Third, you can ask your player to work on improving his weak foot. And lastly, you can ask your player to either pick up a new trait or forget one of the existing traits. It's the second component, additional focus, that I'll be talking about today. Does additional focus really speed up the growth of certain attributes like it says it does? Does it come at any cost, such as slowing down the growth of other attributes? What age does the benefit of additional focus stop happening? These are all questions that will be answered in this video today. Now, before we dive into additional focus, there was something else that I wanted to show you. Remember in part 4 of this training analysis series, I was looking at the effects that different squad status has on player growth. In that video, I compared the amount of growth shown by players when they trained and played in the senior squad, the reserve squad, the U23 squad, and the U18 squad. After I uploaded that video, there were a few people asking me what happens to player growth when they train in the senior team but play the youth league matches. Actually, this is a very common scenario in playing Football Manager, where you have players in the senior team who don't get much match exposure there due to competition, so you give them some youth team game time instead. So I went back to the test setup for the previous video and I ran some additional experiments where the players were placed in the senior team doing senior team training, but only playing U23 league matches for the entire season. So consider this experiment as a kind of like an augmentation of the part 4 video. And let me quickly show you the results. I have a line graph here that compares 6 different scenarios. The blue line is when the players trained in the senior team playing senior team matches. So this is a scenario where the players showed the most amount of growth across all age groups from 15 to 30. There's a purple line here. It's a bit difficult to see this purple line because it's kind of overlapping with a few other lines, but this is a new scenario that I tested where the players trained in the senior team but played U23 non-competitive league matches throughout the whole season. These guys showed pretty good growth, although the amount of growth is not as high as the first scenario. The rate of growth for these players, they do start to fall after these players turn 24. This green line at the bottom is when the players were in the senior team doing senior team training and playing 0 matches during the season. So obviously the amount of growth is the lowest with this scenario. So the conclusion that I made in the previous video remains the same. Having your players in the senior team and giving them senior game time is the gold standard for player growth in FM23. But playing youth team games isn't too bad for growth, at least until the age of 23. So if there's a player in your senior team who's struggling to get some game time there, make sure that they're getting some match exposure somewhere. Training in the senior team and playing non-senior matches is totally fine, as demonstrated by this purple line, and it should be encouraged if there's a player in your team who's struggling to get game time in the senior team. Okay, now on to the main topic for today, additional focus. As always, I'm using the same test league that I've created myself using the editor. I'll display the test setup details on the screen so you can pause the video and read it. I tested 16 different types of additional focus for outfield players and 10 different types of additional focus for goalkeepers. I did not test injury rehab because injury rehab only becomes available when a player recovers from a long-term injury in a Football Manager, and it's a bit difficult to set up a test where the players are coming back from a long-term injury. And also for goalkeepers, I did not test the effects of set piece additional focus training, including free kick taking, corners, penalty, and long throw. because let's be honest, how often are you going to get your goalkeepers to take corners or long throws in your team, right? The players in the test league were all assigned different additional focuses at the start of the season. At the end of the season, I recorded the attributes of the players, and I used an Excel table to compare the growth of player attributes in relation to the default attribute growth when no additional focuses were assigned. I repeated the same experiments when the players were set as either 15 years old, 24 years old, and 28 years old at the start of the season, so that I could compare the effects of additional focus training at different stages of a player's career. And let's go straight to the results. First of all, when all players were 15 years old, I have 16 separate tables here for outfield players and 10 separate tables for goalkeepers. So all these tables are representing the results of a single additional focus training. I'll go through one of these tables as an example because obviously I can't go through all of these tables. So this first table is when outfield players were assigned free kick additional focus training, which supposedly, according to the in-game description, has an impact on two player attributes, free kick taking and technique. All these numbers that you see in the table represent the amount of growth shown by players in relation to the control scenario when no additional focus was prescribed to the players. The top row for each of these tables is the average from all players in the squad, and in the following 7 rows, the data is broken down into 7 different player positions. For example, if you have a look at free kick, the free kick attribute for attacking midfielders, it says 0.8 here, which means when these attacking midfielders were put on free kick additional focus training for the whole season, their free kick attributes grew by 0.8 more than they would have grown if the players didn't do any additional training. I'll show you the raw data in case that sounds confusing. So when the attacking midfielders didn't do any additional focus training, their free kick attributes grew on average from 10 to 10.1. But when the same attacking midfielders did free kick additional focus training, their free kick attributes grew on average from 10 to 10.9. So there's a difference of 0.8, which came from the additional focus training. By the way, I've applied a 3-color gradient to all these cells, which means that cells that contain positive values are shaded in green, and the cells that contain negative values are shaded in red. And the green and all these green and red shades get darker and darker as the values get either higher or lower. So if you have a look at the tables for free kick taking, you can see there is a concentration of green colored cells for the free kick attribute. The highest amount of boost was recorded for strikers and wingers. The technique attribute also grew a little bit across all positions, although the amount of growth for technique is not as high as the free kick attribute. The free kick attribute and the technique attribute did grow more than the control, which is what the free kick additional focus training is supposed to do. So I'm happy to make the conclusion at this point that the free kick additional focus training is working as intended in FM23. By the way, guys, I'll be uploading all these tables on my Dropbox folder as usual. I'll add a link in the description below, so do feel free to visit my Dropbox and look through these Excel spreadsheets yourselves. I've had a look through all 16 different additional focus training for outfield players and 10 different additional focus training for goalkeepers, and I've found that most additional focuses in the game showed promising results that aligned well with the in-game description. There were some exceptions, however. Here is the list of additional focus training where the player attributes didn't really change according to the stated aims of additional focus training. Let's have a look at strength training as an example. Strength training is supposed to boost 2 player attributes, strength and jumping reach. Let me just scroll down to find the strength training. Okay, so if you have a look at this table here, the strength attribute was boosted by a tiny bit for strikers and wingers, but not really for the other positions, which brings the average boost across all positions to 0.05, which I reckon is very minimal. The jumping reach attribute went down for most positions except for strikers. Actually, correction. Remember, a negative value here doesn't mean that the attribute went down. It just means it grew by a lesser amount compared to the control scenario. So here, the jumping reach attribute grew less by 0.13 when players were put on strength additional focus training. So for outfield players, strength additional focus training seems to have very limited effect, if any. For goalkeepers, the story is slightly different. When goalkeepers were assigned strength additional focus, their strength grew less by 0.1, but the jumping reach attribute for goalkeepers grew more by 0.3. So for goalkeepers, strength training seems to be mildly effective for boosting the jumping reach attribute, but not for the strength attribute. Now, if we know that additional focus training can be effective, for the most part, at selectively boosting specific player attributes, the next question is, should you be turning it on all the time for all players in your squad? Well, not really. If you have a look at these tables, you can tell that there are just as many cells colored in red as there are cells colored in green, which means that while additional focus will cause certain attributes to grow more than the default, some other attributes will grow less than the default. So do consider that before you assign additional focus training to one of your players. In terms of injury risk, there's no reason to believe that additional focus training raises the risk of injury. In the game, when you assign additional focus to one of your players, the training load doesn't change, as you can see here, nor does the overall risk of injury, as you can see here. So yeah, no reason to believe that additional focus affects injury risk for your players. Alright, next, let's have a look at the test results when players were 24 years old at the start of the experiment instead of 15. These are the cells for 24-year-old players. It's the same experiment as before. The only thing that I changed is the age of the players. I've had a look through all these tables, and it appears that additional focus is still quite effective for 24-year-old players. Most additional focus training boosted the attributes that they were supposed to boost according to the in-game description, although again, there were a handful of exceptions. This is the list of additional focus training that showed questionable efficacy for 24-year-old players. Alright, next we'll have a look at the test results when the players were 28 years old at the start of the season. These are the tables that show you the results for 28-year-old players. So straight away you can see that the number of green colored cells and red colored cells, there are a lot less here compared to the previous two pages that I showed you. Player attributes neither go up by noticeable amounts nor go down by noticeable amounts. Additional training, for the most part, are still doing their job at promoting the growth of specific attributes. For example, if you have a look at the table for free kick training, you can see both free kick and technique attributes have turned mildly green in color. And also if you have a look at the corner training, you can see the corner attribute is mildly green as well here across all player positions. So I think the additional focus training is definitely still working here for 28-year-old players. It's just that players who are 28 years old don't have much room for growth anymore. So the magnitude of the change is very weak, both in the positive and in the negative direction. The only exception to this is the agility and balance additional focus training, which is quite interesting. I'll show you. So if you have a look at this table here for agility and balance, you can see that the agility attribute went up by pretty good amounts for players aged 28. The amount of boost is almost half an attribute per season. And if you have a look at the entire table, like there, you can see there's a negligible number of cells that contain negative values. which means for 28-year-old players, if you put them on agility and balance additional focus training, they'll get almost one free agility attribute every 2 years at almost no cost. It's not a lot, but hey, if it's free, I'll take it. So I guess you can make a case for assigning your players to do agility and balance training when after the age of 28, and yeah, you get free agility points for your players every 2 years. If you have a look at goalkeepers, you can tell that there's more cells here colored in green for goalkeepers compared to outfield players, which I guess is what one would expect, since goalkeepers in Football Manager games tend to grow for a longer time frame compared to outfield players. At the age of 28, growth of outfield players have more or less come to a halt, but goalkeepers still have some growth potential left in them. So additional focus training can be quite effective for goalkeepers, even into their late 20s. Okay folks, time to make a summary of today's findings. 1. The majority of additional focuses in FM23 are working as intended, according to my experiments. There were a handful of additional focuses that showed questionable efficacy, but for the most part, additional focus training in FM23 is working as intended. 2. The younger the player in the game, the more impact additional focus will have on their attributes. By the age of 28, additional focus isn't really effective anymore, for outfield players at least. The only exception to this is the agility and balance training, which was shown to be effective for outfield players aged 28. For goalkeepers, additional focus training is effective even at the age of 28, which is due to the goalkeepers being able to grow for a longer time frame in Football Manager games compared to outfield players. 3. While selective boosting of player attributes is possible in FM23 using additional focus, it may come at the cost of suppressing the growth of some other types of attributes. So do use additional focus with caution. Alright folks, that's it. What did you think about today's video? Leave a comment below to let me know, and I'll try to reply to them as much as possible. Okay, see you guys all next time. Bye.